video, we're going to cover the mysteries of row gauge. And I want to make this video because I get emails from people who are in such distress. I don't want them to be in distress. They need to like their knitting. But they're working on whatever pattern, and the pattern lists the stitch gauge and the row gauge to achieve the right gauge to make the item. And these knitters are doing the right thing, and they're knitting a swatch to try to make it all work. But when it comes down to it, they're able to get stitch gauge and not row gauge. And there's nothing you can do at that point, because to get row gauge, you need to change your needle size. But if you change your needle size, you're going to mess up the stitch gauge you got. So this is the fact. The gauge listed in any pattern is based on what the designer got, the gauge the designer got while they were designing the pattern. It's not right or wrong if yours is different, it's just that yours is different. And when we're talking about the ratio of stitch gauge to row gauge, that's really a personal thing too. It's actually really hard to get stitch gauge and row gauge perfect for any given pattern. It happens sometimes, but just holding your yarn a little bit differently is going to make those stitches come off the needle a little bit differently, which is going to change the height of the stitch, messing with row gauge and making it tough to get both at the same time. Okay, so now that there's no guilt over it and you still need to knit a swatch, usually the case is that stitch gauge is going to be more important than row gauge. So on any given pattern, you want to focus on stitch gauge, and row gauge is either going to happen or it's not. And if it doesn't, usually that's okay, because a pattern will give you a really specific number, say, to cast on. Let's say we're working on a sweater. We're working on a sweater that's knit from the top down. The pattern will give you a really specific number to cast on for the neck, and then it will say, continue in pattern for 10 inches. It won't say knit 70 rows. It'll say 10 inches. And because it said 10 inches, it doesn't matter how many rows it takes for you to get to 10 inches, because you know row gauge is not important at that point. 10 inches is important. And so patterns are more versatile when they're written that way. Now, if a pattern does say knit for 70 rows and your row gauge is off, you have to hope the pattern has a schematic drawing so you can look back on that, see how long that area is supposed to be, and knit that to make sure it's accurate. Did that make sense? The pattern is not just letting you knit as many rows as it takes, it's giving you a very specific number of rows to knit, and your row gauge doesn't match. You need to look at the schematic drawing to see exactly how long that is and copy that. Now, if it doesn't have a schematic drawing, and you're really determined to knit this pattern, even though it's not working for you so far, the best thing you can do is to email the designer and find out what she intended or how long that's supposed to be. Usually the easiest way to get in touch with any designer of any knitting pattern is to message them on Ravelry, and chances are they've had that question before, so maybe they'll put out some errata for the pattern to make it easier if you're not getting row gauge. Now, this whole video has been about how stitch gauge is far more important than row gauge, but one last note I want to make. There are times when row gauge is more important than stitch gauge, and that's when something is knit sideways. There are not very many, but there are sweater patterns out there that are knit from cuff across to cuff, or hat patterns that are knit not up and down but around this way, and that's when row gauge is the most important of the two. Stitch gauge becomes unimportant at that point. Anyway, I hope that clears some things up. Good luck.